Okay, so the last time that we met for Euro was on Thursday, and we were talking about how during the late 19th century, the late 1800s, that European nations began a new wave of imperialism going to particularly the continent of Africa, but also some places in Southeast Asia, and essentially establishing brand new colonies. Now, of course, it goes without saying that this led to a number of long-term problems for these places that have resulted today in many cases, severe poverty and other issues. And this is because generally when the Europeans went to places like Africa and began carving up the territories, there was very little regard for the people who lived on these places, right, in these places. And so when they drew the borders for the colonies, they were dividing up people who otherwise were part of the same group. They sometimes would bundle people together who were part of different groups and didn't get along. And as time has gone on, these kinds of developments have essentially paralyzed development in a lot of these places. These colonies became highly dependent on the parent country, so to speak, say Britain or France or something like that, who once the colonies started to gain independence, these nations just kind of left them high and dry and left to fend for themselves without really having the necessary infrastructure to be able to, keep up or catch up to the other European nations who had colonized them. So one of the cases in which the most brutal treatment of a colonized people happened was in Belgium, under King Leopold II of Belgium. One example of a long-lasting effect that I mentioned to one of the other cohorts was that, take, for example, Rwanda. When I was in 4th grade, there was a genocide in Rwanda of an ethnic group, so to speak, known as the Tutsi. Now, the Tutsi and the Hutu were the two ethnic groups of Rwanda, but the thing that makes it not really an ethnic group is that these groups are manufactured. The Tutsi, according to the Belgians, had more European-type features, perhaps narrower noses, lighter skin, etc. And because they allegedly looked more European, the Tutsi group received favorable treatment from the Belgians. Meanwhile, the majority group, the Hutu, who were traditionally African-looking, were treated terribly, both by the Belgians and by the Tutsis, who were the favored group. When the Belgians left Rwanda, somewhere in the 1960s, I imagine, basically they said, okay, well, here's a book on democracy. Hutu group is the majority, so they'll be the ones in charge. Well, of course, immediately as the Hutu come into power in Rwanda, they focus their resentment from the last however many years against the Tutsis, and by 1994, when I'm in 4th grade, there's a genocide, and they kill upwards of 1 million Tutsi people. And this is just one, and perhaps it's a dramatic one, but it's nonetheless important. One example of the ways in which European colonialism in Africa has had long-lasting effects into the modern era If you've ever taken a look at a map and asked yourself, how come is it that sub-Saharan Africa just seemingly can't get it together? How come is it that all these places in sub-Saharan Africa are crippled by poverty, pollution, disease, you name it, low life expectancies, and so on? The answer in many cases can be traced back to European colonialism. In 1884, the Berlin Conference, not to be confused with the Congress of Berlin, which happened 6 years earlier in 1878, the Berlin Conference was the meeting in Berlin between the European nations to decide how they would carve up Africa without, stepping on each other's toes. In other words, how can we go about taking this land, making it into European colonies without going to war with one another? And that is what the Berlin Conference was setting about to negotiate. And they recognized the Congo Free State as Leopold's personal possession. The Belgian rulers of the Congo savagely treated the indigenous peoples in their quest for both rubber and ivory, and the Belgian parliament took it away from Leopold II eventually because of the atrocities, and they made it a colony of Belgium in 1908 to be administered by the government rather than as the king's personal possession. So much of the problems in the Congo do fall squarely on Leopold II. So the Berlin Conference from 1884 to 1885 established the rules, if you will, for the conquest of Africa. And it was sponsored by both Otto von Bismarck and Jules Ferry of France. And it sought to prevent conflict over imperialism between European nations. If you'll recall, one of the major issues that had been coming about in Europe at this time was a balance of power problem where Germany was becoming much more powerful. And this upset in the balance of power essentially results in Germany pushing very hard to acquire colonies and become a global trading power on a par with Britain and France. Germany felt very bitter and resentful about the fact that Britain and France had a huge colonial empire from which to draw raw materials and goods and labor and markets, and Germany had very much none. And so starting in the 1870s, 1880s, Germany starts making a push to begin acquiring colonies across the globe to increase their power. And so that's mainly what this point says here. This Congress, or this conference rather, coincided with Germany's rise as an imperial power. And all European powers at this meeting agreed to stop slavery and the slave trade in Africa. That doesn't mean that they're not going to exploit the labor there, though. They very much plan on exploiting the labor. However, it will not be slave labor. They will be paid a wage. And so they agreed to stop slavery and the slave trade, but they still intended to utilize the labor source of Africa. And also another rule was that no imperial power could claim a territory in Africa unless it effectively controlled that territory. This goes back to a conversation that we had about maybe September, relating to Spain and Britain and the differences in their patterns of colonization. If you'll recall, when Spain went to the New World, they had a pattern of colonization where they would go, they would conquer an area, and then they would move on. And this allowed Spain to gobble up huge, vast territories in a very short amount of time. But the amount of control that Spain had over those territories was really limited, because as Spanish conquistadors were moving across the Central and South American continents, they didn't have any permanent settlements, or very few permanent settlements, on the areas that they conquered. So these places were so-called conquered by Spain, but more or less retained their independence to a degree. And so they didn't want European powers going to Africa, conquering a place, setting up a sign that said, you know, whatever, Britain was here, and then moving on, right? They wanted to make sure that if you had a territory, that it was occupied and it was controlled, not just in name only. Okay, so imperialism in Africa. When we take a look at the map of Africa shortly after the Berlin Conference, this is more or less what it looked like. As you can see, just based on the color coding here, and I know it might be a little bit of a distance away from you, but you can take, this is all online. You can take a look at it closer later if you like. The blue areas are the French areas. So you can see that much of the Saharan Desert, the Sahel Desert, which is just south, as well as Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, were all French colonies. As you move further east, from north to south, you'll see a large pink strip, with the exception of the Belgian Congo in the middle there, which of course was run by Belgium in orange, but the pink areas were all controlled by Britain. Now, one of the reasons that in particular those pink areas are very important is because the Nile River runs from south to north through those regions there. It actually originates right around Lake Victoria, down in this region here, okay, near German East Africa. But the point being that the Nile River runs all the way from basically deep in Africa to the north, and it empties out into the Mediterranean Sea. As you can imagine, having this riverway of the Nile, which is the longest river on the planet, was hugely advantageous to the British, who utilized their navy for trading. And then as you go further south into Rhodesia, what is now places like Zimbabwe and so on, and all the way down to South Africa, these areas were also controlled by the British, which were rich in a number of natural resources, rare gems, precious stones, particular kinds of woods, animal materials that the British wanted and used for industrialization. Likewise, you can still see some Portuguese settlements there in Angola and Mozambique. You also still have a handful of Italian and Spanish possessions, although much fewer. There are two places that managed to avert European colonial takeover in Africa. Those two places are Liberia, over here in gray. We'll talk about Liberia in a moment. And Ethiopia, which is in a light shade of green, because for a while Italy attempted to try to take over Ethiopia, but ultimately Ethiopia remains free from European colonization and never formally becomes an actual colony. That's thanks to a guy by the name of Menelik II. Menelik II was an African ruler who was very clever about how he played the European powers off of one another in order to maintain Ethiopian independence from colonization. On the other hand, Liberia has a much more tragic story. Liberia, if you don't know anything about it, is a nation with a capital by the name of Monrovia. Monrovia is the capital of Liberia. That name, Monrovia, comes from U.S. President James Monroe. And the story behind Liberia actually relates to American history. In the years leading up to the Civil War, in about the 1830s and 1840s, the Civil War here in America happened in 1861, and it was, of course, the war to fight for the end of slavery in America. The colony of, or the territory of Liberia became a destination point for freed slaves. And originally, when slavery as an issue in America started to receive more criticism, come under fire, the story goes that essentially there were plans at this time in the 1830s, 1840s to take the slaves and send them to Africa. Idea being, even if you freed the slaves, that black and white folks wouldn't be able to coexist. You have to understand that racism as an idea in the United States was prolific. It might surprise you to learn that racism is a relatively new term. It's only been around for, I don't know, maybe a little more than a century or so. Why is that? Hasn't racism existed for a long time? Yes, it has. It's existed for a very long time. However, because it was so prolific, okay, because it was so encompassing, there really wasn't the language to describe racism, because that's just how the world was. It was just purely racist. It's very difficult to use language to describe phenomena when there isn't a binary to explain that phenomena. Let me put out to you. If everything is always up and there's never a down to compare it to, the only thing you know is up. And so you don't have the language to describe up because there is no down. There's no binary. There's no opposite. Okay? In a time where racism is prolific and literally everybody is racist, there is no language to describe racism because that's just how the world is. It's not until we start to recognize and put language to this understanding that some people are being treated poorly and discriminated against, and other people hold prejudices against others because of purely the color of their skin. And when people start to realize that this is a thing, that's where we begin to have the language to describe what's happening. The idea, getting back to the story on Liberia that I was trying to tell you about long-windedly, is that this idea of having black folks and white folks live alongside one another in the United States, to many Americans, even some black Americans, was preposterous, that it would, quote, never work. And so the idea was to send these freed slaves to Africa. Send them, and I'm using quotes for a reason here, send them back to where they came from. Well, the problem with that is this. The slaves that got sent over to Liberia, freed slaves who got sent over to Liberia, had been living in America for generations. Their parents were born in America, their grandparents were born in America, their great-grandparents were born in America. They weren't from Africa anymore. They were from America. Okay? So when these freed slaves, who the only system that they ever knew was slavery, get sent over to Liberia as freed slaves as part of this plan to recolonize freed slaves back to Africa. Of course, the only thing that they know is slavery, and when these freed slaves get to Liberia, they promptly enslave the Africans living there. So you now have African-American freed slaves who have now enslaved the Liberian African population, and it all gets worse from there. Today in Liberia, There's a startling statistic of something in the neighborhood of, I don't know, maybe a third or more of the population has eaten human flesh before. Cannibalism. Okay? Why? Because of African warlords in Liberia who believed that eating flesh before entering into battle provides one with super strength and other unnatural abilities. The situation in Liberia is amongst the worst on the planet. It is a huge destination for sex trafficking. It is a huge problem with heroin addiction, where kids as young as 10 years old begin using intravenous drugs. And it has one of the lowest GDPs, gross domestic products, of any nation on the planet. So despite the fact that Liberia managed to avert being turned into a colony, we cannot say that Liberia is a, quote, success story. All right. The Germans, as you can see, as well, have acquired a number of colonies here. Togo is still a nation in Africa. It's a very narrow, small nation right here. Here is Cameroon. Here is German Southwest Africa, and then you have German East Africa there. Now, the Germans never really ultimately used these colonial possessions to their advantage. Really, frankly, the fact that Germany had colonies did not practically, in everyday terms, change what Germany was doing back at home. They didn't really use them to their advantage. All right. So the British in Africa. The British had essentially colonial control over Egypt for some time, and they began pushing southward and took control of what is now modern-day Sudan. There was a battle in 1898 in Sudan called the Battle of Omdurman under General Horatio H. Kitchener, where he defeated Sudanese tribesmen and killed 11,000 using the machine gun, while only 28 Britons died. Now, why is this significant? I want you to consider those numbers. 11,000 to 28. Okay? 11,000 to 28. One of the key parts about this new imperialism is the application of industrialism to military technology. They are using extremely advanced weaponry, including the use of a brand new machine gun known as the Vickers machine gun, otherwise known as the Maxim gun. And they can essentially fire off thousands and thousands and thousands of rounds per minute. And they are fighting against people who are coming into battle with literal like wooden melee weapons, spears, knives, swords, other things like that. It goes without saying that the effects of the machine gun were absolutely devastating on these indigenous African peoples, and it made it much easier for the Europeans to conquer them and subdue these places and turn them into colonies. In 1898, there was also something known as the Fashoda Incident. This is where Britain and France nearly went to war over the region of Sudan, each of them claiming that Sudan was their own colony. But France ends up being distracted by that domestic affair back home known as the Dreyfus Affair, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago, where Alfred Dreyfus, the Jewish man, was accused of giving secrets away to the German military. And there was this whole huge incident back home that distracted France from their efforts in the Sudan. South Africa and the Boer War. This guy on the left here is a guy by the name of Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes had become the Prime Minister of Cape Colony in South Africa. Cape Colony, now just a little bit of history on South Africa. South Africa starts off actually as a Dutch colony. There had been a number of people called Boers, Dutch farmers, B-O-E-R-S, Boers, who lived in South Africa, and the British came to South Africa and began taking over these lands and pushing the Dutch colonists further north. As the Dutch colonists moved further north, they of course ran into hostility from these areas where indigenous folks still lived and so on. There was a lot of resentment between the Dutch and the British. They fought 2 Boer Wars over it, the First and Second Boer War. The British end up victorious and taking over the region of South Africa and establishing their own colony there. Cecil Rhodes, if you've ever heard of a Rhodes Scholar is a particular type of grant, if you will, that is given, I believe, to American, maybe it's to anyone, but it's people not from Britain. And if you become a Rhodes Scholar, you're basically given the opportunity to go and study at Oxford University. To become a Rhodes Scholar is extraordinarily difficult. It's extremely prestigious. And of course, you study at Oxford University, which is one of the best universities on the planet. But anyhow, the Rhodes Scholar is named after Cecil Rhodes. Principal sponsor of the Cape to Cairo Dream, meaning Cape Colony, Cape Town, down in South Africa, all the way up to Cairo. And if you look at this map here, that's essentially what the British do. They connect together all of their colonies from Cairo, right up north there in Egypt, all the way down to Cape Town. And you can see here, symbolically, Cecil Rhodes connecting those two places together with a telegraph wire. That's the line that he's holding in his hand. And this is the idea where Britain would have colonies from south all the way to the northern part of Africa and dominate the entire continent. Diamonds and gold were discovered in what was known as the Transvaal region, and Rhodes wanted to extend his influence there, but the region was controlled by Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers who had been there for a long time. So, South Africa and the Boer War. Here you can see that I was talking about the Transvaal region there in green. There was a war fought to secure these territories and rid the lands of Dutch influence. The Kruger telegram ends up playing an important role in this. This is where Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany dispatched a telegram to the Boers, the Dutch farmers, congratulating them on defeating the British invaders without the need of German assistance. And the reason that this is significant is because, number one, the Dutch didn't win this war. The British did. So why would the Germans send a congratulatory message saying, hey, you're so awesome, good thing you didn't need German interference, congratulations to you? It was deliberate by the Germans, Kaiser Wilhelm II, to anger the British, and that's exactly what it does. Anger swept through Britain, aimed at Germany, and eventually a massive British force eventually defeated the Boers, and in 1910, the Transvaal region, the Orange Free State, Cape Colony, and Natal combined to form the Union of South Africa. Likewise, to the racial problems that the United States has faced since its inception, there are a number of racial problems that immediately began emerging in South Africa, namely a system known as apartheid, which is listed in capital letters there at the bottom. I know it looks like apartheid, but that's not how it's pronounced. It's apartheid. What is apartheid? Well, if there was any way to take the system of racism in the United States and somehow make it even more twisted and horrible, That's apartheid. Imagine the Jim Crow laws on meth, okay, basically. It is really unique because here in America, the majority of the population is white, which means that when black folks in America were treated badly, it was at least in part as a result of the fact that they were the minority population. It was easier for the white Americans of the 1718 and early 1900s to discriminate against black folks because they only comprised about 10 to 12% of the United States population. They're the minority. Makes them easier to subjugate and oppress. Unlike America, though, South Africa had a population of about somewhere in the area of 98% black folks. Yet, the 2%, the gross minority of white folks who lived in South Africa, may not have even known that the entire population was largely comprised of black folks, because the system of apartheid made the racial segregation in South Africa so dramatic that white folks in South Africa never would have even encountered a black person in their everyday lives. The entire society was completely segregated. They never stood in the same lines together. They never rode the same buses together. They never attended the same schools. They never lived on the same streets. They never went to work in the same regions. And the entire government of South Africa was run by the 2% white population that lived there. The first time that we see a black president of South Africa does not happen until I was in 4th grade. The guy by the name of Nelson Mandela, whose story is really an interesting one because he was part of a group called the African National Congress, the ANC, that was considered a terrorist organization back in the 1960s. He was put in jail for nearly 30 years for being a threat to the state. This is Nelson Mandela. By the way, Nelson, not his name. When Nelson Mandela was in kindergarten, he had a traditional African name. His teacher could not pronounce it. She said, from here on out, you're not going to be called that anymore. You're going to be called Nelson. Named after Horatio Nelson, the naval commander who was killed in the Battle of Trafalgar during the Napoleonic Wars. I want you to imagine showing up to kindergarten class when you're about 5 years old and your teacher telling you, I can't pronounce your name, so that's not what you're called anymore. You're going to be called this now. Imagine your name and your identity, right? When you think about who you are, your name is a big part of that. And they took his name away from him. He fought for the rights of black South Africans and gets put in jail for nearly 30 years, gets released from jail, becomes the president of South Africa in 1994. Does he use this opportunity to get revenge against the white man? Could he have? Of course. Does he? No. Despite immense upset, anger, resentment from a whole lot of people who had been treated extremely oppressively in South Africa, Nelson Mandela says that using violence to take aim at historical wrongdoings doesn't make a right. And he instead carves a path for South Africa to get rid of apartheid and start to mend the long-lasting racial tensions that have existed there. Pretty incredible story. Nelson Mandela only passed away a few years ago. If you want to see a movie where he is depicted by Morgan Freeman, it's called Invictus. Invictus has Matt Damon and Morgan Freeman. Morgan Freeman, who plays Nelson Mandela, does a fantastic job. Anyhow, France ends up taking control of Tunisia, Algeria, French West Africa, including Morocco, the Sahara, the Sudan, and the Congo Basin, as well as Madagascar. Germany, prior to 1884, Germany was more concerned about the dangers posed against its eastern border by Russia. But after the Berlin Conference takes place, they took control of Cameroon, Togo, Southwest, and East Africa. Most Germany conquest was non-violent, except for Southwest Africa, where a local rebellion resulted in the Germans killing over 50,000 men, women, and children. Italy in Africa. Italy is very much the small, underpowered nation of Europe at this time. They do not have the same military or industrial prowess that a place like Britain or Germany has, and thus their conquests in Africa are not going to be as successful. Nonetheless, they do end up taking control of Eritrea and Libya from the Turks in 1912, but the Italians ultimately get defeated by this man, Menelik II, on the left here, in the Battle of Adowa in, when was that? 1880 somewhere, 1888, 1890 something maybe, and the Italians were defeated. Meanwhile, you also have imperialism in Asia, and you can see here that the British once again controlled vast amounts of territory in Southeast Asia, going all the way down actually to Australia and New Zealand. Never mind the fact that the French controlled areas such as Vietnam, the Dutch controlled much of the East Indies, Borneo, Sumatra, New Guinea, and then the British also controlled Malaya, the Solomon Islands. Japan is not really a colony. Japan instead becomes an imperial power by the late 1800s and begins colonizing their own areas, including Korea. Korea gets turned into a colony by the Japanese. The treatment of the Korean people by the Japanese was amongst the most brutal in European or in world history, I guess. The Japanese essentially turned the Korean population into a slave race for about 20 or 30 years. And then you have also the United States, who had a significant influence in the Philippines after the Spanish had controlled the Philippines for some time. And then you also have a Russian sphere of influence that's pushing over into kind of this region over here. As they build the Trans-Siberian Railway, the Russians become prominent in this area of northern China known as Manchuria or Manchukuo. And this is where they eventually run into problems from the Japanese in what became known as the Russo-Japanese War at Vladivostok. Okay. China. Okay, talking a little bit about China. The British had gone to China going back all the way to the beginning of the 1800s. Okay, so even though the new imperialism that we're focused on here is primarily focused on the 1880s, 1890s, really in order to understand the story of China, you have to go back quite a bit further. And I'm, of course, talking about imperialism in China. The story of Chinese history goes back literally thousands of years, but we're only going back to the early 1800s. For years, the British had tried to find goods that the Chinese would want to purchase from the British. Why? Because China, I want to just give you a little bit of a comparison here. Do you guys know what the current population of the United States is here in 2021? You know what the population of the U.S. is? Good information to know in case you ever get asked it. We have about 320 million people here in the United States, about a third of a billion, 320 million, okay? By comparison, do you know what year China had 320 million people? Today, do you know how many people China has? More or less than the United States? More. Today, the population of China rests at about estimating 1.2, 1.3 billion people. That's 1/7 of the population of the planet living in China. China, by the time that the British go there, in the early 1800s, already had, in 1820, the number of people that America has living in it today. In other words, the United States has taken 130 years or more, actually longer than that, nearly 200 years, okay, to catch up to the population that China had 200 years ago, okay? Consider that for a minute because it's pretty interesting. That number of people in the early 1800s would have basically been an infinite market for British-made goods. And that is why the British want to trade with China so badly, is because there's a lot of consumers in China that will be able to purchase British-made goods and make the British a whole lot richer. Okay? However, China at this time is run by the Qing Emperor, Qing, Qing Emperor, which I know I'm butchering, but I don't speak Chinese, so forgive me. All right? The Qing Emperor takes a look at all of the amazing goods that Britain has to offer: clocks, cotton, or wool textiles, and all these other things. Actually, probably some cotton by this point. All right? And the Chinese say, thanks, but no thanks. We don't want any of these things. It took a little while for the British to find something that the Chinese would want to buy. Okay? And they found it. It was called opium. Now, if you don't know what opium is a product derived from poppy plants that is a natural painkiller. Okay, it's a natural painkiller. Opium, you might better know from other terms. Morphine is derived from opium. Heroin is derived from opium. Opium is a highly, highly addictive psychotropic substance. And when the British begin trading opium into the Chinese population and they start consuming it, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Chinese people become addicted to opium. It becomes a huge, huge problem. And the opium that they are consuming is being provided to China by basically the efforts of the British in India, where they are able to grow and extract opium and then ship it just directly north to China. The Chinese did not like this, obviously. The emperor was extremely upset. And when the Chinese tried to resist the British influence of the influx of opium into their lands, they fought a war for trying to block the British from being able to trade there. It was called the First Opium War. It's a short-lived event because the British, by this point, already have a massive industrialized navy. The British were not about to take their troops and fight a land war with China. And instead, they used their navy to completely subdue China. And the resulting factor of the First Opium War became known as the Treaty of Nanking, which forced China to give permanently, essentially, Hong Kong over to Britain. In fact, it lasted all the way up until I was in 7th grade. Hong Kong was a possession of the British all the way up until 1997, which was the end of the term of the Treaty of Nanking. And they had to pay a large indemnity, open up 4 large cities to foreign trade with low tariffs, and the British from that point on were not only allowed to continue trading opium into China, but they now had control over all of China's coastal ports. That does it for me today, folks. Have a wonderful rest of your day.